Who is Edward P. Jones, and what makes his work worth reading now? A.O. Scott, who was here last to discuss Wallace Stegner, joins us to talk about the second writer in his essay series, The Americans. How have hurricanes shaped, damaged, and destroyed parts of the United States over the years? Eric Jay Dolin will be here to talk about his new book, A Furious Sky. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's August 14th. I'm Pamela Paul. A.O. Scott joins us now to talk about Edward P. Jones. Tony, thanks for being here.
It's great to talk with you.
So, Edward P. Jones is the second in a series of essays that you're writing for the book review called The Americans. The last one and the first was Wallace Stegner. You were here to talk about him. Talk a little bit about the project generally and the kind of writers you're looking at and why.
It was partly motivated by a kind of frustration with some of the discussions about American culture, American identity, American history that are happening now in this highly politicized, highly polarized environment that tends to sort of squeeze everything down to red and blue, to liberal conservative, in all of these very kind of reductive ways. And it had been my experience for a long time reading American writers from various eras of various backgrounds that the picture that we get of what American life is in literature is always more complicated, more contradictory, more nuanced, less easily assimilated to or reduced to ideological or political or identity categories. And so I thought it'd be interesting to find some writers who are not very much spoken about now. It's not so much about rediscovering obscure writers or forgotten writers, because Wallace Stegner is well known, and Edward P. Jones too. His books have been bestsellers. He's won a Pulitzer Prize. These are not kind of obscure or forgotten writers, but they are writers who I felt like might give us a perspective on American life that's missing, or that we might need to or want to pay attention to now in the middle of everything else that's going on.
I don't know if you read our colleague Parl Sagel's review of this debut novel by Raven Leilani called Luster this week. But apart from her criticism of the book, she talked about at the end this tendency right now for us to see novels as kind of these bearers of contemporary messages, a sort of messaging device, as opposed to looking at the work in itself, that you don't look at Anna Karenina, for example, to like read about, I don't know, the limitations of women in the 19th century in Russia. You look at it to read about these characters. And it strikes me that you're doing a similar thing, or looking at writers who do a similar thing in a similar way.
I agree. I mean, I was very struck by that passage in Parl's review, because it really did, I feel like, resonate with what I've been thinking about, and with some of my own frustration with, even with criticism in film and in books and in other art forms, that there's such a focus on now, on the moment. What does this tell us about this moment? I understand that in a way as a kind of journalistic question, but I don't think it's a question that motivates or interests a lot of readers. So certainly reading Edward P. Jones, who is a Black writer who writes about the lives of working and middle-class Black people in Washington, D.C., mostly throughout the 20th century, and whose novel, The Known World, is about the period of slavery just 10 years before the Civil War. Obviously, there's a lot in his books that is relevant to various political and social questions and arguments that are going on now. But the point of reading the books is to understand the books and to understand the characters and to feel what they feel and to see the world as they see it and to learn about them and to get to know them. And that seems like a much deeper and more valuable for novels to do than simply try to give us the news that we're probably already getting anyway from elsewhere and maybe are even a little sick of hearing.
Parl in her essay made this distinction between timelessness and timely. And yet, of course, the timeless books are always timely.
Right. I mean, they're written in their own time. I don't think any writer, any serious writer, any writer worth reading sits down and says, I'm going to write a timeless book. I'm going to write a book about universal themes that will endure forever. A writer sits down and writes because they're interested in writing about something, or they had an idea, or there's a story, or a character or an incident or something that they want to work on and want to think about. And the wonderful byproduct of that intention, if they're lucky and if they're talented, is something that other people in other times and other places can discover and say, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is speaking to me. This is a reality that I want to be in, that I want to know about." It's very curious how that, and nobody knows. One of the great things about literature is nobody knows quite how or why that happens. Why there are some books that you can pick up 20 or 50 or 100 or 200 years later that just seem to jump right into your life and into your present and kind of take it over and change it.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm going to talk about this a little later on the podcast with some of my colleagues here at the book review. But the book that I just read is Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, which came out here, I think, last year, but was written, I think, in the 90s. She's a Japanese writer. And it felt like she was writing about right now, which obviously she is not. So it had that same eerie, eternal timeliness. Let's talk about Edward P. Jones. What made you decide to focus on him for your next essay?
Unlike with Stegner, who I'd read a little bit of and was sort of curious to discover more about, Edward P. Jones is someone whose entire published oeuvre I had read, a lot of it more than once. There are two books of stories, Lost in the City and All Aunt Hagar's Children. And in the middle of them, this wonderful novel, The Known World. And I sort of felt like I just wasn't hearing enough people talking about him, and I was having a lot of conversations with very well-read friends of mine of various tastes and backgrounds and temperaments and talking about writers we'd liked. And I would mention Edward P. Jones and people hadn't read him. So I thought, well, this needs to be a little bit more on the map. And if I can do something, using the platform of the New York Times Book Review to do that, I'd like to do it. And also I was thinking in the wake of George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement and the reemergence of the questions about racism in America and about the lives of Black people in America, that Jones is a writer who has a lot to say and a very rich and unusual perspective on those kinds of issues to offer. Again, not in a kind of overtly polemical or political way, but the matter of Black life, of Black lives, is really his subject. And I was also thinking about how the two books of stories, Lost in the City and All Aunt Hagar's Children, are all set almost entirely in Washington, D.C. And it sort of occurred to me that city, for all it gets talked about and all of its importance in our national life, is kind of underrepresented in American literature. And I thought, in a way, he's kind of a great regional writer, and the region is the District of Columbia.
I was going to ask about that Washington fiction angle, because even when you say the phrase Washington fiction, people assume that you're talking about political novels. They assume it's, Thomas Mallon or, some kind of satire. And I remember a young Nigerian American author, Uzodinma Iweala, who had a book come out that took place in Washington a few years ago. And when he talked about what motivated that particular novel, he said, nobody ever talks about like people who just have other jobs, who live in Washington, D.C., like the doctors and the lawyers and, the teachers and et cetera. So what Washington do we see in Edward P. Jones's work?
An important thing also that you don't really see, let's say, on, television programs about American politics or movies about Washington and the Capitol and the White House, is that currently almost half of the population of Washington, D.C. is Black. And the people in Edward P. Jones's stories have roots, depending on when they're taking place, often have roots in the South and have come to the District of Columbia kind of as part of the Great Migration, but didn't make it all the way north to the industrial cities like Baltimore or Philadelphia or Detroit or New York or Chicago, because Washington is still, it's below the Mason-Dixon line. It's a southern city. And in some ways, just in the way that he deals with memory and family, you could classify Edward P. Jones as a Southern writer, and there's certainly an influence of Faulkner, and other Southern writers in there. But he's very specific always about the neighborhoods that he's talking about Northeast, Northwest, Anacostia, Southeast. Nearly every story in his two books of stories has kind of street directions. Like you could go on Google Maps and find the intersection that a certain thing takes place at, or find the address that a character lives in. And they work various jobs that lower middle class and working class. Some work for federal government agencies, some work in hotels, some are storekeepers or custodial workers or domestic workers, some are doctors or lawyers, but they all carry with them this very particular and deep sense of Black Washington, and also in very many cases of the southern places that they came from, and in some cases came from to escape violence, lynching, racism, and landed in Washington, which is both a kind of a promised land and also a very hard and unjust and sometimes cruel place. And I've never particularly liked Washington as a city. I've only gone there as a tourist and never been all that impressed by it. But the beauty and the sweetness of life in that city is captured in these stories in a way that I've never seen anyone else do.
Now, Jones is alive, unlike Stegner. I don't know if he is still writing or not. Do you know?
I hope so. I always await news of the next thing that he's done, not to put any pressure on him, but
I think you're going to end up inadvertently putting pressure on him, but maybe that'll be a good thing for his readers and possibly for him. But these stories, are they primarily contemporary? Is this Washington today? What's the period?
The period is various points, mostly in the middle decades of the 20th century, but it does come up to now. And sometimes, even though the place is always specified, sometimes you have to intuit or guess at the decade. And he reminds me a little bit in a way of the playwright August Wilson, who wrote a cycle of plays set in Black sections of Pittsburgh. And each play, in his case, corresponds to a decade, takes place in a different decade of the 20th century. And there are sort of echoes and overlaps. And you see a lot of that in Jones's work, where characters in one story come back in another story, or an event that happened in one story is kind of recalled from a different point of view in another. So you get a sense of the web of life that connects characters across space and time. But, sometimes it's the 50s or the 60s, sometimes it's the 70s or the 80s, and you kind of pick up cues. Sometimes there'll be a reference to a popular song or a style of dress or an event in the world. But what you get more than anything else is a sense of the sort of the continuity and also the cyclical nature of life, that people are being born, falling in love, dying, breaking up, having fights, moving from one neighborhood to another, changing jobs. And it's all happening within a world that almost feels, in a funny way, even though it's urban, that almost feels pastoral, and that the rhythms seem to be seasonal rather than chronological or historical.
He did one collection, and then The Known World came out, and then this other collection. Just let's talk about The Known World, which won the Pulitzer Prize, for a moment, because I think that if people know the name Edward P. Jones, it's generally in connection with that novel. Do you know anything about how and why he came to write that book? And in between what feels like a kind of quite different, at least in terms of time and setting, body of work?
He's said that it was suggested by kind of the historical footnote of learning that there had been in Virginia and elsewhere, that there had been freed Black people before the Civil War who had owned slaves. And he was just very interested in what that would have been like and what kind of world would make that possible, and what it would be like both for the slave owners, the free Black slave owners, and the enslaved people and their white neighbors. I mean, it's a very sort of Faulknerian novel in that it takes place in a fictitious county in Virginia, and populates that county with very vividly imagined characters from all different points on the social scale. So there are rich white landowners, there are Black farmers who own slaves, they're slaves, there are slave catchers, bounty hunters, preachers, fortune seekers, the sheriff. Everybody is included in this imaginative world. And in a way, I think it's trying to provide a kind of a, almost you'd say a backstory or an attempt to imagine a world that's continuous with the world of Lost in the City and the other stories. I mean, I almost think that there is a sort of an Edward P. Jones universe that all of his fiction takes place in, so that you could, just as you can trace the continuities and the echoes among and overlaps among the stories, you could probably do that with the known world also. But this is sort of like, well, where did this world come from? That is the world of Lost in the City, the world of contemporary, modern 20th century Black Washington. What are its roots? What are its precedents? What are its precursors? The families that we're reading about in these stories, where did they come from? What is their history? And what's remarkable is how much attention there is to every phase of every character's life. It's, I mean, the novel, it's not a short novel. It's, 400 pages or so long, but it feels at the end as if you've read many volumes, because he has this ability to, even if he introduces a character for a couple of pages who never comes back, who's sort of an incidental person passing through or delivering a message or in a crowd, you get a sense that that character has a whole life, a whole destiny, a whole history, a whole set of feelings and ideas and attitudes and things that they've imagined that feel very real to you. So there's a human richness in this story and in this novel that's really unusual. I can't think of very many novels that have that with quite that density and with a just variety of time. It's a very funny book. It's a devastatingly sad book. There's horrible things that happen in it and just sort of magical and wonderful things that happen too. And it's a book you want to really slow down and read, at a very kind of deliberate, appreciative pace.
Okay, you've sold me. But since you focus on the short fiction, I just want to end with one story, and I won't ask for your favorite because I know that's always difficult, but maybe one of your favorites. Tell us what you would recommend if someone wanted to start on Jones's short fiction. What story would you recommend?
Well, it's a good question because the two books, in a way, demand to be read all the way through, because each one, they mirror each other. Each one is 14 stories, and they're sort of matched so that the first story in both volumes is about some of the same characters. But I would say the one that gives to me a sense of what he's interested in and what he can do is the title story of Anne Hager's Children. Because of all Anne Hager's Children, which is in the middle of that book, and it's one of the longer stories. I think it's about 30 pages long, and it takes place in the 50s. The main character is a young guy who's been in the army, and it's kind of a detective story. So he's sort of working as a sort of amateur or semi-professional private detective as he's thinking about going to law school. And someone that he knew from childhood has been killed, and the guy's mother asks him to try to figure out, because the police haven't figured out what happened. And this is layered in with the main character's own recollections of a sort of traumatic incident that he witnessed on a streetcar in DC. And it's also layered into a story about the mother of the murdered man and how she and two of her friends escaped from Alabama after being subject to a terrifying moment of racist violence there. So, and that's the barest summary. So in these 30 pages, there's a novel. There may be 2 or 3 novels, but the way that he weaves them together with a kind of economy and also a sort of ease, what his stories often do is start you out in one direction and then swerve in all of these other unexpected directions. So you don't end up necessarily where you thought you were going when you started out. So you almost immediately want to go back and read it again. You get some of the answers that you want to the questions that have been posed in the story about the murder, about the escape of the girls from Alabama, about the narrator and the main character's encounter on the streetcar. But somehow the story isn't really about any of those things, or isn't even about the answers to those questions. It's a much richer and stranger kind of bottomless reading experience. So that would be a place to start. And it's a very accessible story. It has a whodunit detective novel kernel in it. And then you just want to keep reading. I mean, if you're anything like me, you will just want to live in this world of Edward P. Jones for as long as you can and go back and visit it as many times as you can.
Well, I want to keep talking about this with you forever, but alas, we are out of time. It is always such fun to have you on the podcast. I look forward to the next writer we talk about in your essay series. Tony, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, always.
Tony Scott is a co-chief film critic of the New York Times, working this year as a critic at large and writing a series of essays for the book review called The Americans. He is also the author of a book called Better Living Through Criticism. Eric Jay Dolin joins us now from Marblehead, Massachusetts. His new book is called A Furious Sky, The 500-Year History of America's Hurricanes. Eric, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You timed this, right? To have like a tropical storm/hurricane hit the United States on your publication date.
Yeah, it was definitely fortuitous for the book launch, but not so much for all the people who unfortunately were in the hurricane's path. And I have to say, this summer is, and into the fall, is going to prove, I think, timely for the book in many respects. There was a new report today from Colorado State University, who does forecasts of hurricanes, and they've upped the level of hurricanes and tropical storms for this season. It's going to be, they predict, an historically active season. They're expecting a huge number of tropical storms and 12 hurricanes, where in a normal year we typically have only 6.
Does that mean 6 making landfall in the United States or 6 existing and maybe floating off into the distance?
Right, it's the latter. Normally we have 6 that go across the Atlantic, and 3 of those are major, and 2 hurricanes usually hit the United States annually. But now they're predicting we're going to have 12 hurricanes, and 5 of those, as opposed to 3, are going to reach major hurricane strength, category 3, 4, or 5, with sustained winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. And also that report today said there is a 74% chance of a major hurricane hitting somewhere along the United States coastline this year.
How can they know that?
They base it on a whole bunch of characteristics, meteorological characteristics, whether there's an El Nino, an El Nina, and the temperature. Right now, the temperature of water in the Atlantic is way above average. And they look at past records, and they have computer models that can help to calculate what is likely to happen. So it's a whole bunch of factors. It's as much science as it is art.
Did you get to go to like the National Weather Center and sit in on these kind of predictions as part of your research? I know your book is largely historical, but how do you get a sense of what a hurricane is and how we track it?
Well, unfortunately, I don't want to let your listeners down, but I didn't go to the National Hurricane Center, nor did I get an opportunity to fly in a Hurricane Hunter plane. But one of the fortunate things when you're an historian doing research on this kind of topic, there is a plethora of information out there. There are hundreds, thousands of books, articles, newspaper accounts, diaries, you name it. And a lot of the meteorologists who have been very active in recent decades and going back a century or more have written down their perspectives on the hurricanes that they were covering and the evolution of the hurricane itself. So there's plenty of real-time primary material that I was able to tap into. But as I like to say, I wrote a book on whaling, and I never harpooned a whale. I wrote a book on the fur trade. I've never trapped a beaver. Wrote a book on pirates. I've never done piracy in the open ocean. And here I've written a book on hurricanes. And I wouldn't classify myself as a meteorologist or even a severe weather nerd, but I was able to tap into what those people are thinking and doing by virtue of what they've written over the years.
But presumably you've lived through a hurricane. You've been in a hurricane or an area where a hurricane is hit.
Yes, I hope this interview is not going to be a real downer for your listeners, because I have never been in an area where a hurricane has made landfall. I've certainly felt the remnants of hurricanes. When Hurricane Sandy made landfall in New Jersey and really did a number on New Jersey and New York, it was such a massive storm, about 1,000 miles in diameter, that even way up here where I live in Marblehead, we had a lot of damage along the coast, a lot of power outages. Hurricane Bob that did strike parts of Massachusetts I remember pieces of that, but I have never lived through a full raging hurricane. And that makes a little bit of sense because New England only gets about 5 to 10 hurricanes a century. If I was living in Florida, which is the all-time leader in hurricane strikes, they get about 40% of all hurricane strikes, then I am sure I would have had personal experience living through many hurricanes.
See, I wanted to hear some tragic childhood story that propelled a lifelong interest in this subject. But since we don't have that, why did you get interested in writing a book about hurricanes?
Well, I'd always been fascinated by hurricanes, like everybody who watches the coverage on the air. I didn't know a huge amount about hurricanes, but I had thought I wanted to someday write a book on a single hurricane. Unfortunately, the two hurricanes that intrigued me the most were the Galveston hurricane of 1900 and the great hurricane of 1938, which plowed into New England, and people around here have many memories of that. The problem is, for both of those hurricanes, there have been a number of very good books written. So I didn't want to add another book to the mix. So I put aside my hurricane idea and I worked on other books and was coming up with other topics. And then 2017 struck, and everybody remembers 2017 as the summer of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. It was like a 1, 2, 3 punch, nonstop coverage on the air and on radio. And everybody was focused on that, including, it turns out, my editor and the sales director at Liveright, which is part of W.W. Norton. They said, wow, hurricane's fascinating topic. Eric, you have a lot of experience writing books that span hundreds of years and synthesizing a huge amount of information. So they wrote a letter to my literary agent and said, would Eric be interested in writing a book on America's hurricanes? And he forwarded that to me, and I was intrigued. I didn't say yes right away because I went off for about a month or two. I read a bunch of books. I tried to plot out what the book would look like. And then I was in. And I was primed to say yes because I had been interested in writing a book about a single hurricane. And now I had an opportunity to write the broad swath of American history using hurricanes as a narrative backbone for the book. And I'm really glad I did. It was one of the most fun books I've ever written, even though it's filled with misery and destruction.
So let's actually talk about America in relation to hurricanes, because hurricanes are an American storm, right? I mean, you have typhoons, essentially, it's the same kind of thing, right? But in Asia?
Yeah, a hurricane by a different name, spells the same, I guess. Typhoons are basically hurricanes. That's what they call them in the northern Pacific. In the Indian Ocean, hurricanes are referred to as cyclones. In Australia, they're called, either typhoons, or some people call them willy willies or cockeyed bobs historically, but they're all basically the same thing. But the hurricanes that I focused on are the ones that struck what is today the United States. And we call all of these cyclones that exceed 74 miles per hour sustained winds hurricanes in the Atlantic and also in the Eastern Pacific. And that's why when a hurricane hits Hawaii, it's called a hurricane, not a typhoon. If it was further over towards the Philippines or Japan, it would be called a typhoon, but it's the same meteorological event.
You call this a 500-year history and go back to the colonial period, but presumably Native Americans experienced storms, had explanations for them. And obviously there are many different nations, so I'm sure it's not uniform. But in general, what was their experience and explanation for this phenomenon before the colonists arrived?
Of course, I mean, hurricanes pop on into the Western imagination with Christopher Columbus, the first Westerner to experience a hurricane. But since time immemorial before that, as you said, natives in South America, Central America, North America, they all had experienced hurricanes on a regular basis. They attributed them to the work of the gods. And in fact, their names, the different cultures, had somewhat similar names for the weather god that wreaked havoc upon them every once in a while. The Taino Indians in the Antilles called it a hurricane, and the Mayans called it a hunraken. And from those words, Westerners adopted those words and turned them into what we know as hurricane in English and other variants in different languages. But the natives were very familiar with hurricanes. And in fact, they did Christopher Columbus a service, even though he was often acted horrifically towards the natives. He interacted with a lot of them, and during his first 3 voyages, he didn't live through a hurricane, he and his men, but they were on the outskirts of some major storms, and they heard from the Taino Indians about these massive storms and some of the signs that indicated that they were on the way, like a brick red sky in the morning, a long, deep swells, some high cirrus clouds. So Columbus learned by his communication with the natives a little bit about how to predict the coming of a hurricane. So on his 4th voyage in 1502, he had been told not to stop in Santo Domingo, to bypass Hispaniola because he had such a bad reputation there. But when he got there, he and his men in their ships, their little fleet of ships, he saw these signs. He knew that a hurricane was coming, or at least he thought one was coming. So he pleaded with the governor to let him and his men come into the sheltered bay or port of Santo Domingo to ride out this hurricane. And he also urged the governor not to send the 28 vessels that he was preparing to send back to Spain, filled with all the gold and silver that Spain had wrested from Central and South America, because it would encounter a hurricane. But Columbus was a little more self-interested than that. One of those 28 ships was called the Aguja, or the Needle. On board was all the gold and silver that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had promised Columbus for his earlier work in this part of the world. So he didn't want his treasure to go to the bottom of the ocean. Well, Governor Ovando ignored Columbus entirely. He didn't like Columbus anyway, but he ignored him, didn't allow his ships to come into port. Columbus didn't rue his situation. He went further along the coast, found a sheltered embayment, and rode out the storm. But unfortunately, Governor Ovando sent this fleet of 28 ships out, and just barely a day out of port, it encountered a huge hurricane, and most of the ships sank to the bottom. Many, many people killed, including this guy named Bobadilla, who was the person who had put Christopher Columbus on trial just a few years before and caused him to be sent back to Spain in chains. So after this event, one other thing I have to mention is, guess what? Christopher Columbus's ship, the Aguja, made it through. So his treasure made it through unscathed. Because of that, and because Bobadilla was killed, and because he had predicted a hurricane, which Governor Ovando didn't know a lot about, Columbus was branded a sorcerer and a prophet, and that he had brought this storm down upon the fleet as retribution to the man who had put him in chains.
Hurricanes were not always conducive to colonization. A couple of instances you point out in the book. Tell us about the French attempted colonization of Florida and the way in which a hurricane interfered in that.
Oh, yeah. Fascinating story. I knew nothing about this. One other thing I wanted to mention, almost all the books that I write are on topics that I don't know a lot about, because I want to remain engaged and I get to learn sort of along with the reader later all these exciting stories. But in Florida in the 16th century, and around 1565, the French had been trying to establish, well, they did establish a foothold on the east coast of Florida. They were transporting Huguenots there to start a colony and get them away from France, where they were being persecuted. Well, Spain claimed control of almost the entire Western Hemisphere, and they didn't like the French being interlopers and going into their domain. So King Philip didn't believe when he heard that the French were only establishing a colony for persecuted Huguenots. He thought they were establishing a colony to create a foothold from which they could launch attacks on the Spanish treasure fleets leaving from the Caribbean and going back to Spain. In effect, he thought they were going to become pirates to some extent. So he got together a huge force under a guy named Pedro Menendez. And so at the same time, the French fleet was going to reinforce the infant French settlement, and the Spanish fleet was sailing across the Atlantic as well to confront the French. Well, they both got there within a couple of weeks of each other, and they both wanted to oust the other. So when the French forces got together, the fleet sailed down to St. Augustine, what is now St. Augustine, to rout Pedro Menendez and his men. They had many ships, 400 Marines, 200 soldiers, but right when he was about to launch his attack, a hurricane comes in and sends the entire French fleet scudding down the coast into the shallows off Cape Canaveral, where the entire fleet sank and about half the men were killed in the boiling waters, and the rest pulled themselves ashore. In the meantime, Pedro Menendez assumed that the fleet had been destroyed. So he said, this is my opportunity to go attack their fort at Fort Caroline, which is further up the coast. So Pedro Menendez goes north, he attacks the fort, kills a bunch of Frenchmen, and then he says, okay, I'm going to go back down the coast to protect St. Augustine, but also to get any stragglers, any Frenchmen that might have survived that horrific hurricane. And he found about 200 French soldiers trying to make their way back to Fort Caroline. What did Pedro Menendez do? A man, along with his country, who had deep enmity toward the French. He bound their hands behind their backs and executed the majority of them. And the reason this is fascinating to me, history turns on pivotal events. And if one thing had happened or another thing had happened, subsequent history would have gone in a different direction. Well, just imagine if that hurricane hadn't come by. The French fleet was very powerful. Let's say the French had beaten the Spanish. Florida would have fallen into the French orbit in the mid 1500s. But because they didn't have success and because of that hurricane, Florida became a Spanish colony essentially until the mid 1700s. So history might have been quite different.
I mean, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, all of the European colonists who came over to America, to the Americas in general, they had never experienced anything like a hurricane before. You don't have that kind of storm in Europe. What do the early firsthand accounts say? What do they make of this?
Well, that's true. Europe does not encounter the full force of hurricanes, although the remnants of hurricanes do often go up the East Coast and shoot across the North Atlantic and can bring tremendous rains and winds to Europe. And they've had some great storms there, but they're not usually in the path of what we would call hurricanes. So the first Europeans were like Columbus, were shocked, and their accounts are very traumatic reading because they talk about the incredible devastation and the absolute power of this storm to wipe away anything that humans have created. But after a while, they got used to them. They still thought they were just something that was God's design. They didn't understand the meteorology. And when a hurricane came in, they knew there was going to be a lot of devastation to follow, such as the Great Hurricane of 1635, which really walloped the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony and sent many ships to the bottom of the ocean. So they got used to hurricanes, especially once they settled here. And the further south they settled, the more used to hurricanes they became.
What was the worst storm, the worst hurricane to hit the United States in its history? And I guess when you talk about that, how do we define the worst? Is it in terms of property damage, in terms of lives lost, in terms of the size, the duration?
Well, to answer that question depends on who's giving you the answer, because there are different ways to cut it. If you're defining the worst as the most deaths, then clearly the far and away winner is the Galveston hurricane of 1900, which basically obliterated the island of Galveston, killed at least 6,000 people, but maybe as many as 10 or 12,000 people, because there are a lot of people summering there and the records aren't as good. So that is the worst natural disaster that the United States has ever experienced. But if you're talking about just monetary damages, then Hurricane Katrina in 2005, especially adjusted for current value of money, is still the all-time leader. It generated damages on the order of $125 billion back in 2005. So it depends. If you want to look at the most damaging hurricane to human lives, it's Galveston 1900, the most expensive and probably the one that most of the country is familiar with. It would be Hurricane Katrina.
Let's end on a future note. We started off, you were talking about the forecast for the coming fall. You obviously now have a very good sense of the havoc a hurricane can wreak in terms of human and property damage and destruction. Do you feel like the U.S. is well positioned now in terms of our understanding of the science, our ability to predict and react to hurricanes, that like we've got this, or does this all make you nervous?
Oh, no, it makes me nervous in terms of the science and meteorology and being able to understand how hurricanes form and being able to track them from their inception to dissolution. We're in great shape. We've got a wonderful National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center, and we've got satellites and hurricane hunter planes, and we really can get a good bead on any hurricane as it moves towards the continental United States or Hawaii. So that we're in very good shape. Where we falter, and the history of hurricanes shows this time and time again, is both in our planning in advance of hurricanes, making our structures more able to withstand what the hurricanes are going to bring, doing planning, especially coastal planning, that takes into account the periodic impacts of hurricanes. And so you don't build in places that really aren't that good to build. Then dealing with the aftermath, we've had big problems because these are incredibly expensive storms. Hundreds of thousands of people, even millions of people are impacted with power outages, their houses being destroyed. And it takes a massive effort and a united effort to try to deal with the aftermath of these storms. And that costs a lot of money. That takes a lot of planning, a lot of forethought, a lot of coordination. And in many instances, as I describe in the book, those structural elements have failed to fall into place in a way that leads to an effective and coordinated response. So there's no doubt that we are going to continue to be pummeled by hurricanes. The scientific evidence is mounting, and I think very persuasive, that in a warmer world that we're heading into, the hurricanes of the future are going to probably be more intense, higher winds, more major hurricanes maybe, wetter. They may even go slower and sort of stall in place like Harvey, and that will just subject areas to winds over a longer period of time and a bigger deluge of rain. So we need to be thinking as a nation, as well as local communities, especially along the coast, what steps we can take now to better position ourselves in the future. Have evacuation plans that everybody knows about, have shelters that are fully stocked, make sure that emergency information systems are working properly. So there's a lot we can do to ameliorate the impact of hurricanes on society. There's nothing that we can do to stop them from coming ashore periodically and wreaking havoc.
All right, you've made me nervous too, Eric. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The book again is called A Furious Sky: The 100-Year History of America's Hurricanes by Eric Jay Dolin. Eric, thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
You've got some news on book sales.
Yes. Again, good news, at least if you're one of the already well-established and well-known authors who has released a book under very challenging circumstances during a pandemic. Stephenie Meyer's new book, Midnight Sun, which continues her Twilight vampire saga, this time from the perspective of the vampire Edward, sold more than 1 million copies in its first week, which is pretty astonishing considering all the challenges to the retail landscape right now. Of course, this book was always set up to be a blockbuster. The Twilight series has sold something like 160 million copies worldwide was the latest count. And her fans have been looking forward to this book for more than a decade. It was supposed to come out 12 years ago, but after part of it leaked online, Meyer decided not to release it. She was kind of spooked, and she spoke to our colleague Concepcion de Leon about this and why she changed her mind and decided to go back to the story. But it's another example of a tentpole book doing really well, kind of against all odds this year. And we've seen print sales really hold steady from the latest NPD BookScan numbers. For July, book sales were actually 16% higher than they were in July of 2019. Of course, that was helped by books like Mary Trump's memoir, which was a massive bestseller. It sold more than 1 million copies already, and it just came out in July. And John Bolton's book has been a big hit. So you're seeing across the board big nonfiction and fiction selling well. I guess the question is for authors who are less well known or trying to establish themselves, how do you break out a new voice right now? And that's been a real challenge. Even though publishers have seen print sales overall remain pretty steady through the shutdown, through the pandemic, the gains are kind of unevenly distributed. So smaller publishers, mid-sized publishers are struggling a little bit, as well as debut authors and authors of nonfiction who are not releasing, really explosive memoirs about the president.
Are people sick of TV, do you think? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, this is a great question. Maybe the golden era of TV has waned a little bit and people have binged everything. We're all stuck at home.
We're all done. We've reached the end of Netflix.
That's right.
There was just announced, you and I are speaking on August 13th. The next Bob Woodward book was just announced. So you have to imagine, it's going to be yet another one of these runaway nonfiction books from an established name. I mean, we don't know, but it would seem likely.
Yeah, given his track record and the few details that have already emerged about the book, it seems like another Bob Woodward blockbuster. So what we know so far, it's coming out in September. The title is Rage. And this time Woodward had more than a dozen or around a dozen interviews with the president. And
wow.
They started in December 2019 and they went up through late July 2020. So he's definitely covering the recent unrest in the country and the massive twin challenges of the pandemic and the economic crisis. And another little tidbit that I think will prove interesting to people is that he apparently has obtained 25 personal letters that were exchanged between Trump and North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, which show them to be having this close relationship. And so I think those few details, and there's obviously more that they're holding back on because I'm sure they're anticipating a massive TV rollout. So yes, I think we're going to see more political bestsellers in the fall leading up to the election. And it's already a very crowded fall because of all the books that got bumped from the spring. So it's going to be probably a pretty good season.
All right. Well, it sounds like we will have plenty of big books to talk about later this fall. Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues John Williams and Lauren Christensen. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
John, let's start with you. What are you reading right now?
I've taken on a task. I know that earlier this summer, I told people I was going to read a 900-page book about the French Revolution, and I kind of didn't. This is actually going to happen. I picked up Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song for some reason.
I cannot believe you have not read this book, John.
It's a little surprising to me that I haven't read it too for some reason. But first of all, this is an 1,100-page book, literally. So I am 250 pages into it, which feels like I'm done with the preface. And I've taken to reading, 30 to 40 pages before bed every night, figuring that I'll be done by Christmas that way. And it's about Gary Gilmore, who very famously in the 1970s was released from prison in the American West, only to commit more heinous crimes, and then to request that he be executed by firing squad. And it's a fascinating story. It's obviously very grim and dark. And many years ago, probably, 25 years ago, I read Gary Gilmore's brother, Mikhail Gilmore, who was, I think, a writer for Rolling Stone and some other places. He was a journalist, wrote a memoir called Shot in the Heart about Gary and about the situation. And I really liked the book. And unfortunately, I can't find my copy of it. And I have a feeling it's gone, which is very sad.
I hate that.
Yeah. And I might have to get it and reread it because now I'm interested in what I saw in it, because I think that book was fairly, I don't want to say purpley, but it was very somber, and it was written in a kind of a fairly strenuously poetic way, but that worked, I think. Whereas Mailer's book is very much I want to say styleless, although obviously with Mailer that's a choice and it's a style, but it's a very sort of rat-tat-tat, one thing after another kind of style, and which makes it thankfully very quick to read.
Right, it's like very journalistic.
It's very journalistic. It's a novel technically, so it's it's a very fictionalized version of all of these things that happened. I mean, he's writing scenes that obviously he couldn't have been there for. He's in characters' heads in ways that he definitely couldn't have been. I think now I'm getting to a part where he's starting to use some transcripts of interviews with police and things like that. So there are non-fictional documents in it. It is an act, I think, mostly of imagination. But it is, yes, it's written in a way that feels sometimes newspapery. It's not ornamental. There isn't a lot of figurative language in it at all, which makes it very propulsive. And I'm really enjoying it. And for readers who are curious to go back into our archives, Joan Didion reviewed it for the Times Book Review. So that's up online if they want to search for that.
In my mind, I think I probably read that around the same time that I read In Cold Blood, just like that sort of teenage, early 20s, like fascination with, like terrible things.
Yeah, that's what I read In Cold Blood too.
Sorry. And I reread Cold Blood about 15 years ago, and it totally stands up. But I didn't remember the Executioner song being so long, maybe because it did feel like a very propulsive read.
Yes, I can imagine 10 years from now, I won't remember it as that long, but it's funny because I've been going to a local bookstore that reopened just to browse. And I went 2-3 weeks ago with this book in mind for some reason. And I said to myself, if they have it, I'm going to get it and I'm going to read it soon. And I knew that it was long, but when I got to the shelf, I saw it and I thought, am I going to keep this promise to myself? And I did, because it's enormous. I mean, I can't get over the dimensions of it. But
is it mass market paperback, the version you have?
No, this is it's essentially a trade paperback. It's very big in all ways, both lengthwise and depth.
Lauren, have you read it?
I have not. I am actually reading another very propulsive in a completely different way novel, and I have been dying to talk about it since I read it a little bit earlier this summer, but it just came out, Raven Leilani's Luster. It's obviously a debut a lot of people are talking about right now. The story follows Edie, a young Black woman who makes very little money in her publishing job and also just finds little satisfaction in it to make it kind of worth the relatively bare bones Brooklyn existence that it's offering her. And after, several unfulfilling sexual relationships with coworkers, Edie meets this much older white man online. They begin an affair. He's in an open marriage. So is it called an affair? Yeah, I think so. And I won't discuss the details of the plot, I guess. But long story short, his family, right? Yeah, I don't know. Long story short, his family doesn't just find out about her; they get to know her, and then the facts of her identity, her race, her socioeconomic status, and her age come into really sharp relief against his. We have 2 reviews of it. Parle pointed out that it's a novel about work, about the disadvantages that Edie faces as a young Black woman in an older white world of book publishing. Jasmine Hughes today reviewed it for TBR and pointed out how sexual the novel is. There's just so much carnal detail. And what struck me as one of the most original and relatable themes in the novel was the way Leilani really refashions the sort of coming of age trope. And it's right there in the opening page, when Edie and Eric first have sex, and presumably it's online. He's uptown working with microfiche, and she's downtown working on a children's book. And, this is a young adult. She's 23 years old. She's with a man who is a father and a husband. He's twice her age. He has money and a career and a family and an entire house. And she has really nothing but talent. She's obviously brilliant through her voice. She's also a painter. And that is this strange dynamic that she has with this family that isn't hers. Edie almost regresses into kind of the role of an adolescent child. And I really appreciated the non-linearity of growing up, as Leilani puts it, and figuring out what you want in the world, what you want out of it. Lots of people are calling it a millennial novel. Of course it is, because she is a millennial. But I do think that there's something about this self-doubt and the precariousness of growing up that is really timeless. And it just, it's sort of accidentally millennial, but I think it would resonate with really anyone. I was so impressed by it.
I don't want to get into generational. Well, I guess I do want to get into generational nitpicking, but Leilani may be a millennial, but what is the character's name? Edie?
Edie.
Isn't Edie Gen Z?
What is the year? I mean, she's 23.
I think to be a millennial, you had to be sort of in high school-ish at the turn of the century.
What John is saying is you're too old for this book.
She's a young professional right now. I think her circumstances. She's not Gen Z. She's not like on TikTok. It's not
We'll take this offline.
Okay.
I can tell this is going to get messy. I'm going to marshal some evidence.
read the book and let me know what you think.
Pamela, what are you reading this week?
It's funny. The book that I've been planning to talk about, I finished reading a couple of weeks ago, but I've really been looking forward to talking about it. And it turns out to be kind of an eerily perfect day to discuss it. The book is The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. It was translated by Stephen Snyder. And the reason it's a eerie day to talk about this is that today is August 6th, and it is the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And it's also a day on which the author, Yoko Ogawa, published a piece in the New York Times. The piece is titled How We Retain the Memory of Japan's Atomic Bombings Books. So I didn't know any of this when I planned to talk about this or when I planned to read it. One of the interesting things about this book is that it came out in the US just last year, but it was written in 1994. And I mentioned earlier in my conversation with Tony Scott, we were talking about, timelessness versus timeliness. This book feels very timely in unfortunate ways. So the story is about an island, presumably in Japan, where things suddenly will disappear. And it might be something like roses or fruit. And when it disappears, not only does it go away, but everyone loses their memory of it. And any physical remnants of whatever this thing is needs to be immediately cleared out. And there is this presumably governmental agency, the Memory Police, who will come in and forcefully remove things if you don't destroy them yourself. And so in the case of the nameless narrator, her father was an ornithologist. And when birds are lost, that he just kind of loses his way of life. And one of the people that she's friends with at the point at which the novel begins, both of her parents are dead and she's living alone, and she's a novelist. And she has a friend who's just called the Old Man, and he was a ferryman, but ferries disappeared. And so when people lose their jobs because the thing that they have done is gone, they sort of will just come up with a new thing to do. And the book tells this story from the first person, and it's interspersed with excerpts from the novel that the narrator is writing. And I just want to read one teeny passage, because what's interesting is that some people in this world that she's created remember things. And so they too become a target of the Memory Police. It's sort of very Orwellian aspect, and they will be taken away. And so some of them go into hiding. And the main story in the book is that the narrator's editor of her book, is one of those people who remembers everything. And so she decides to hide him in her home. And has like little teeny elements of the recent movie Parasite in it, and this idea of like people hidden away in a chamber. So the narrator asks her editor at one point, how does it feel to remember everything, to have everything that the rest of us have lost saved up in your heart? That's a difficult question, he said, using his forefinger to push up the frames of his glasses and then leaving his hand at his throat. I'd imagine you'd be uncomfortable with your heart full of so many forgotten things. No, that's not really a problem. A heart has no shape, no limits. That's why you can put almost any kind of thing in it, why it can hold so much. It's much like your memory in that sense. So you have everything inside you that has disappeared from the island? I'm not sure about everything. Memories don't just pile up. They also change over time, and sometimes they fade of their own accord. Though the process for me is quite different from what happens to the rest of you when something disappears from the island. I could continue reading. I hope that would just whet your appetite to want to know more. It's so interesting. It's so well done. It's really dark. I think I read it. This has not been a lighthearted moment in time. I think I read it, at one of the particularly dark moments of our dark current period in a way that it almost felt like, I don't know, someone like a teacher or a therapist or a parent would come in and be like, you really shouldn't be reading that right now. That's not really good for your mental well-being. Nonetheless, I would highly recommend this book. It's really good. And I would recommend reading Ogawa's essay in the Times that was published today.
I have that open in a tab right now.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. I mean, what she's writing about is that, it's really important for us to read literature of the Japanese experience in World War II, but also of all the other sort of horrors in recent history, whether in Japan or elsewhere, because this is where we retain our memories. So it's obviously a theme that she was exploring in this book. And I think it really resonates right now, where in our culture currently, we seem to be grappling with this idea of like, should we be forced to look at things that are difficult to us if they're painful, if they make people uncomfortable, if they're hurtful? And I think that her answer to this question is certainly yes. No matter how hard it is, no matter how much you might find it difficult, painful, perhaps it's insulting to you, or it makes you feel guilty or complicit, or it makes you feel like you're the problem, whatever that may be, you nonetheless need to expose yourself to it and to think about it. I mean, I feel like that's a very powerful message too for right now. Have either of you read Ogawa?
I read a bit of it, yeah.
Oh, did you read The Memory Police, Lauren?
Yeah, I read part of The Memory Police when we reviewed it. And one of the things that really struck me, I remember, is the fact that you never really know what's motivating the memory police. It's not really explained why society is being ordered this way. It's just kind of taken as a given.
Yes, yes.
And that's something that really struck me, I remember.
That part of it reminded me a little bit of Han Kang's novel, The Vegetarian. And what Han was doing in that book, I thought was interesting in that there's a little bit of a withholding. It's like almost like I'm not going to explain all this to you, but I'm going to plunge you within it and allow you to figure that out for yourself.
Right. And that really mirrors your actual experience, right? I mean, sometimes you just have this kind of nameless sense that something is happening beyond your control or your ability to understand it. And I think that's a really powerful tool of the novel.
Last summer, I went on vacation. I took her book, The Diving Pool, which is a collection of 3 novellas. And that was really great. But I haven't read anything else by her.
You can do that for next time, guys.
You've added this to my list.
Okay. All right. Let's run down the books that we read once more, John.
I'm reading The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer.
I'm reading Luster by Raven Leilani.
And I read Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police. All right, so fun to talk to you all as ever.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.